Hi and welcome to video 169, where I've been busy replacing the broken springs on this abandoned Ford Focus, which I bought for £250. Now this was going to be a single video on replacing both suspension springs, but as I tend to do a lot of detail in the videos, it's forced me to split the video into two. So this video will be about replacing the near side spring only, and next week I'll do one on the offside spring. So I do hope this video helps you as much as my others have, and if so, I would really appreciate you taking the time to give the video a thumbs up and hopefully subscribing to see more of my content. So take care all and have a good weekend.
So the first job to do is actually remove the wiper arms so that we can gain access to the suspension turrets. So what I'm going to do, just to hopefully make it easier to get the wiper blades back in the correct position, is I'm just going to put a little bit of electrical tape on the top of the blades, so that hopefully that's where they should line up next time I come to refit. Otherwise they could possibly start hitting each other when I refit them if I get it wrong. So we just got to lift up these like a plastic cap there that prevents the nut from going rusty, as you can see, and then we can use a 15mm socket and just break loose the little nut, and there is a washer there underneath, and then a little bit of wiggling around and the wiper blade should just come free. So that's the passenger side done. We'll just pop that to one side. Now for the driver's side, we do need to go under the bonnet. So again, we just pop that plastic cap off, get the nut off, the washer. It's a little bit more awkward this one because the blade is actually under the bonnet, but it's soon out. So then we've got 6 spring clips that we just need to ping off here. So we'll speed this up a bit. It's our second one, third one, fourth one. I say speed up, I could have probably sped this up a little bit more. And the final 6th one. Okay, so what we should better do now is lift the scuttle cowling panel up and away. Now it's actually clipped onto the bottom of the windscreen. There's a plastic strip on the windscreen, and this actually sort of tucks on top of it. So you can see the plastic bit there. It's come away from the windscreen a little bit there on the right hand side. And then again on the off side we just need to get that loose. It does seem an awful lot of work to gain access to the suspension turrets, to be starting to remove the wipers and all that lot. So we just get this panel out of the way. So then we need a Torx 30 for 2 screws on either side, because there's like a bulkhead panel that also needs to be removed. So there's one of them. They're like a self-tapper, those are. And then just one more on the other side. It's also a good opportunity to actually clean the car. Like I said, this is the abandoned car, so as you can see, it was sort of going back to nature. Okay, there are now 4 spring clips. There they are, pinging them away there. Sort of locate that panel, and then that panel should come off. Right, so we've now got full access to the fixtures on top of the suspension turrets, and there is also some bracing bars there on top as well. Now it might be worth at this point to actually check and clean the earth connection. So Mr. J Macy kindly advised me on this after he broke down on the way home. So a 10mm socket here, and it's actually quite stubborn to actually undo. And as you can see, the actual washer's starting to split apart as I actually remove this. So I think this is quite an important earth connection to the body of the vehicle. So it's probably well worth taking this off, just cleaning it all before carrying on with the suspension while you've got access. Because as you can see, that doesn't actually look very good. So just run a Dremel over that. Get that all nice and clean. Replace it with a couple of washers. And then hopefully that will maintain a good earth connection, avoiding any issues perhaps later on. I'll also give it a dab of copper grease there just to cover that. So we can now actually get on to removing the road wheel. So we just need to break the wheel nuts loose first, which can be quite tricky on this. Now, my actual locking wheel nut was really tight, so you do need to be careful you don't actually shear that off when you come to undo it. And as for the nuts, it's normally a 19mm socket if it's still got its chrome cover on. If it hasn't, then an 18mm should do the trick, but if it's swollen, you might find you need either 20 or 21mm socket to try and remove them. Then we can actually jack the car up and remove that road wheel and see what we've got. So one thing to be careful of here is you can get some ball bearings start falling down when you start touching the suspension. So just be aware of that. Cloth underneath may be helpful. So at this point, it might be worth just seeing some photographs of what's coming up. So we just identified there, obviously we've got the brake disc, the brake caliper, there's the suspension strut, and there's our drop link, the steering track rod end, drive shaft, there's the spring and the loose bearings at the top there, and the protective gaiter. So okay then, let's remove the anti-roll bar from the strut. So I'm just going to try and get the nut to move a little bit with a 15mm socket, and then I'll go on to a 15mm spanner and a 5mm hex key, because you've obviously got to keep the centre of the ball joint steady while you undo it. Now, this nut does need to be replaced with a new one on reassembly. So what I'm going to do now is just lift the suspension up to take the tension off that drop link, because obviously you've got the anti-roll bar pulling down on that. So that makes it come out a little bit easier. You may need to turn the steering just to give yourself a little bit of space to get that ball joint out. That's the broken spring twanging away there. Okay, so that's now out, and we've got the ABS bracket there as well. You can probably leave the bracket on the cable. So that's now all free. Just drop that back down again. So just bear in mind, if you do disconnect the ABS cable, you may get an error code that you may need to clear later on. So I'm just going to turn the steering now the other way to give me access to the lower bolt. So I'm just going to add another couple of photographs here to show what it actually looks like when the strut has been removed from the car, so you can see the different parts and the hub carrier. So that's what it looks like when it's removed. Okay, so now we can remove the strut to hub carrier bolt. So I had an absolute game with this, and it literally took me a whole day to remove these two bolts. So that's what they look like now. So anyway, so it's a 15mm socket. Take your time on this, because the heads can sort of smear over if you put too much pressure on, which is what happened to me. So these are the new heads I've welded on to the original bolt. Now these bolts actually do need to be replaced, so you shouldn't actually reuse them. But that's my modified bolt that's come out nice and easy, and it certainly wasn't like that before. I had to use a welder and that. So anyway, so we just get the flexible brake pipe off there, and also I'm just removing the bracket there off the ABS cable, but you probably don't need to actually do that. You could probably leave that in position. And also just disconnecting the ABS wheel sensor. And like I say, once you disconnect that, if you put the ignition on, it could well log an error code. so maybe worth trying to keep the ignition off if that's disconnected. Right, so we'll put that to one side. So now I'm going to just straighten the steering, because I'm going to start trying to hit it with a hammer a little bit on the hub carrier. So it should come off reasonably okay with some firm persuasion. So there it is, it's dropping off now. So just make sure the drive shaft doesn't try and pull out of the gearbox, because it's now under a bit of strain from the weight of the hub and the brake disc. So try and support it if you can. Okay, so now to remove the 3 turret bolts. Okay, so going to underneath the bonnet now, we can use a 13mm socket. Might be worth just spraying them a little bit with some plus gas there. And just remove these. Now, I should leave one at least holding, the one nearest to the side of the car, to the wing, so you can undo that while you're actually holding the strut. Otherwise, it's just going to fall straight onto the ground. And those ball bearings, like I said earlier, will just shoot everywhere. So that's now all loose. So here we are. So as we come down, I wasn't expecting all these ball bearings to suddenly fall everywhere. And they are quite small. There's 36 of them, and they're only 4.75mm in diameter. So because the protective gaiter has sort of fallen down, it's brought all the ball bearings with it in the race. So there's our strut, all very rusty, but it's not actually leaking any oil, so it should still be okay. Yeah, so there's the ball bearings, and as you can see, we've got plenty of holes there, because the ball bearings have now just disappeared all over the garage floor. As you can see, they're quite small, so that's why I say a cloth might be helpful just to catch them if they all start to fall on the ground. So there's our split, or where the spring sheared. And as you can see, that's a nasty sharp spike there. Sometimes that spike can actually go into the side wall of the tyre, which is not good news, because then it costs you a tyre as well as a spring. But anyway, we get this spring off. So thankfully these parts are actually quite cheap on the Fords. I think these are only like £20 each for the springs. And it's obviously worth replacing them in a pair, because if one fails, then the other one's surely going to follow quite quickly. Okay, so looks like we need to find some ball bearings now. So, time to go ball bearing hunting. So, I went over all my driveway to try and find the ball bearings. I had all of them apart from 4, so I really wanted to find just those 4, and I was hoping they might have been outside, perhaps when the suspension was pegging away, but unfortunately I've got some of the Ford Focus there. Well, got quite a bit of the Ford Focus, but sadly no ball bearings. Okay, so it might be worth seeing some photographs now of the stripped down struts, so you can actually see all the different parts that are going to be involved in removing the spring. And obviously there's the bearings. That gives you a bit of a heads up. So now we can get on to fitting the new coil spring. Okay, so we just put the strut in a vise there. Now I'm going to use the laser set, and I'll put a link in the bottom of the video description for anyone that wishes to buy that set or any of the parts, because it does make life a little bit easier here, because we've got pass-through sockets. So we want an 18mm pass-through socket and a 6mm hex. Now the beauty of this set is we can actually attach the ratchet to the outside of the socket. So this part, the hex goes in the middle, but we can put our socket on first and then put the hex in the middle to hold the centre of the strut rigid while we undo it. Now I did adapt an old socket as shown in the top right when I did a Ford Fiesta, so you could sort of adapt an old socket if you need to. But anyway, so that's the nut off, and that nut should be replaced with a new one. And here's the remains of my bearings and that. Now obviously logically you would probably replace this all, you'd probably actually replace the whole strut, to be honest. But like I say, this is an abandoned car, so I need to do everything as cheap as possible at this point. So as you just saw there, a load of bearings have just completely fallen out all over the floor now, so we're in a complete mess. Obviously if you bought a new strut you would avoid all of this, but where would the fun in that be? So let's get the bearings found, and we're going to have to clean those now obviously and try and refit them. So what I've done is I've sort of cleaned it all up with a bit of paraffin, and I'm going to just use some silicone grease here, mainly because it makes it easier for the camera to actually see the bearings. So I'm only 4 bearings short, and I've put those in opposite points, so I don't think that should affect things too badly, and it's all nicely greased up now. I'd prefer to have found the 4 bearings, but wasn't going to be. They might have been lost somewhere else, perhaps where the car was located or stored for those few years. But anyway, we've got plenty of silicone grease in there. That now turns nice and smoothly, so hopefully that's a winner. Okay, so now actually onto the spring part. So for this, so what you might be worth doing is just checking the piston, and normally you would do this with it vertically and just push down and make sure that it's all nice and smooth and that it returns without any jerky motion. A little bit of jerky motion there, but we'll ignore that. But it's working. Okay, so we've got a new spring. So like I say, these are about £20 each. So that's the particular one for this car. So they might all be different depending on what engines you've got and everything else. So I'm just going to line up the spring just to check that it looks the same and there's no obvious differences, and perhaps there had been a mistake in which spring was put in the box, because you never know with returns and stuff. Again, this would probably be easier if you actually did it vertically, but I've done it this way just to help the camera see everything. So I started off with these long sort of spring compressors, but to be honest, I never really seemed to get on with those. But I was actually trying to trying to use them. But ironically, every time I use them, I always resort to the Sykes Pickavant, the old type, that has like a double thread on it. It sort of pulls in both directions. Here they are. So as soon as I put those on, they seem to pull in really well, and the other ones are now just falling off. So I don't know why I bother with those. Okay, so we've just got to get that central strut now through. Don't forget this should be a new nut, and we can use our pass-through socket again to tighten this. And this will need to be tightened to 50 Newton meters. So to achieve that, what I'll have to do is use a crow's foot sort of end on the torque wrench. Now they must be set at 90 degrees to the head of the torque wrench, otherwise you'll effectively be over tightening the nut. So make sure it's always at 90 degrees. There's our click. So that's nice and tight. So that's all back on now, so it's just a case of releasing the tension on the springs. So always make sure you wear eye protection when you do anything to do with suspension springs, because obviously if one of these came off in your face, it would definitely cause an injury. So there we are, we've got that off. That's all ready now to go back on the car. Mind you, before we do that, we must just pull down the gaiter and that protects the strut so that it doesn't go rusty or pitted, which would then damage the seal in the damper part. So there we are, that's that all finished. So we can now refit the strut back to the car. Okay then, so we just need to offer the strut up inside the turret and screw it in place. Now you may need to turn this, which can be quite difficult, but you've got to line it up. So I'll try and sort of show to the camera, that's how it lines up. So they're not all equal. So as soon as we can get one bolt in, and that will just hold it. Like I say, if you've got it not lined up correctly, you'll get a bolt in, but then the other two won't fit. So just be aware of that. Okay, we've got two in there. There's our third one. So now we can go around and tighten those up with our 13mm socket. Just trying to find that socket there. So I'm just tightening them bit by bit to bring the strut up level without it coming up at an angle. And then we tighten those to 32 Newton meters. Like so. So I now need to just rotate the strut to line it all up, because obviously we've got to put the drop link back on, and it has to be lined up with the hub. Now there is a little metal tang at the back of this. Mine was a bit damaged, so it wasn't easy to sort of notice. But there is a metal tang there that has to line up with the slot in the back of the wheel hub. So I'll show you now with some photographs. There it is. And then if I colour that in, try and make it a little bit easier to see. And coloured in again. That should be straight and flat. So worth noting that. I must have knocked it perhaps. So now I'm having to just try and straighten it up. And line it up with a mirror, which was quite awkward. But anyway, so that's now in. So onto the drop link. Pop that back in there. And again, don't forget a new nut should be used. And don't forget to install this bracket. It can be quite easy to pop the nut on and forget about that little bracket. And then once that's tight, I'm just going to lower the suspension down. And then we need to torque that new nut to 50 Newton meters. So there we are, set the torque wrench to 50. Just tighten that. There's our click. Okay, so we can now just reattach the ABS cable and hurt yourself. The other one's not going to get me because I'm going to use a hammer. Don't forget to reconnect your ABS. So now we can fit a new strut clamp bolt. So just ignore the fact that's my adapted old one. Though, to be honest, I can't ever see that coming out with the amount of corrosion on the thread. So anyway, we're tightening that up there. For me, it's a 16mm socket. Normally it would be a 15. And then we need to torque that to 90 Newton meters. Like so. Okay, and like I say, I wasn't joking. I'm going to use a hammer for this little bit, because I'm not going to hurt my fingers again. There we go. That's that popped back in. Okay, so I think we can now refit the road wheel. Okay then, so let's pop this wheel back on. Now, it might be worth just noting that although my wheel nuts are 110 Newton meters, there are gold nuts for steel wheels, and they're 90 Newton meters. Silver nuts for steel wheels, and they're 130 Newton meters. One-piece alloy nuts for alloy wheels and 5-spoke steel wheels, and they're 130. But like I say, for mine it's 110 because they're the 2-piece alloy nuts with the conical washer. And always remember to tighten in a cross-diagonal manner so it's nice and even. There we go. So I'll just include here some torque settings now. So that might help you if you've taken other parts off to do with the suspension. So you may wish to pause that. And now for some reference photographs. So here we are. We can just obviously see the brake disc that we saw before, the brake caliper, suspension struts, the drop link, steering track rod end, the drive shaft, the loose bearings and the spring, the piston rod protective gaiter, and there it is with the strut removed. Obviously, if you need to pause these, it's probably better to pause them so you can actually view these photos in more detail if you need to. And there's the all-important disassembly of the strut and those ball bearings. Got a full complement there in that one. And obviously the little tang at the back of the strut. So, you've been watching how to replace the Nearside spring on a Ford Focus Mark II with the 1.6 Ti petrol engine. And thank you for watching and supporting my channel, and please like and subscribe. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in March 2023, and I can be found on Instagram and Facebook as Coats and Gaiters.